Good morning, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to speak today about our Climate Smart Cities programme and the work we've done looking at the economics of low-carbon cities around the world. The work has been conducted by a large team of people who have collaborated and been fantastic colleagues over a number of years, some of whom are here today, and they're all listed on this slide, or some of them at least are. So some of the background has been rehearsed as to why cities are so important and so central to the climate story. I won't go into all of the detail, but we've heard that cities are growing very rapidly. In emerging markets and developing countries, 1.2 million people per week are being added to the urban population, frequently not through formal planned growth, but through informal, ungoverned growth. And there are enormous challenges with formalizing and governing that mode of urban growth and urban development. And those populations and contexts are massively important, but we shouldn't forget also that all of the forecasts suggest that we will still have well over 1 billion affluent, high-consuming people in cities in developed countries by 2050, and a significant share of the climate impact of cities will be still residing with them. IPCC estimates that over 3/4 of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to cities, both through the fuels that they consume directly and the electricity that they consume, or in other words, their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And various estimates, and I'll talk about this later, also suggest that if we take into account their Scope 3 emissions, or the emissions embodied in the consumption that takes place in cities, then the share of emissions attributed to cities goes up even more. So cities have to be central to any response to climate change, and yet there has been a substantial amount of effort and work put into them, but as Dimitri just said, to some extent they've been something of a blind spot in the wider global conversation. Our work, as with many other people's of course, was inspired by the Stern Review and the very simple economic message that came out of it, namely that the costs of avoiding dangerous climate change are much less than the costs of suffering dangerous climate change. So we started some years ago with a very simple question, which was, well, is there a similarly compelling economic story to be told about the case for climate action in cities? We adopted a different approach and had different boundaries from the Stern Review, in that we just focused on the direct case for climate action in cities. So this is not about the benefits of climate change avoided or the resilience impacts of low-carbon development, and they may be significant, but instead was focused purely on the direct economic case for investing in low-carbon cities. So we deliberately moved from a long-term global social case, such as that presented in the Stern Review, and zoomed downwards and on the nearer term, looking at the medium-term local direct case for climate action. This was very deliberate and very conscious, and the aim was to appeal to, or see what the evidence base was first of all, of course, but then to appeal to city-level decision makers with an economic case to encourage them to take action where the evidence was supporting that. We've worked at 2 levels on this, and the first tranche of our work was at the global scale, somewhat contradicting what I just said, looking at the case for climate action. And this was work done with the Global Commission on Economy and Climate last year. And here we worked with colleagues to look at the kind of low-carbon investments that cities around the world could make. And we zoomed in on 3 key sectors, namely buildings, transport systems, and the waste sector. And we looked at the kind of cost-benefit case, and again we're focusing very much on the direct costs and benefits of cities adopting ambitious low-carbon strategies. And here the work on the low-carbon side was done by the Stockholm Environment Institute, looked at pathways that were compatible with a 2 degrees future, and obviously Paris has encouraged us, and the science compels us to be more ambitious than that. But what our economic analysis said was that that this could present an enormous economic opportunity. And more specifically, what we found was that cities could feasibly, economically at least, make a very ambitious contribution to the 2 degree scenario. And since then, various people have suggested that perhaps half of the gap between the impact of the INDCs in the Paris Agreement and the 2 degrees target could be delivered through economically beneficial investments at the city scale. And we worked out that the net present value of the saving stream that would come from those investments through more energy efficient buildings, through reduced fuel costs, and so on. And this is excluding the wider co-benefits in terms of air pollution and health, or employment and access to the markets and so on. The net present value would be worth $16 trillion in the period to 2050. So an enormous stream of benefits available to cities who make these kind of investments, which kind of reinforces the growth story that Nick was talking about earlier. But we also looked at some of the key sensitivities and found that actually at all but the lowest energy prices and the highest interest rates, these investments would be economically positive. And that with some technological learning, as the price of solar panels came down and a wide range of other investments, that all of them would be profitable over that period. And so the story was that these shouldn't be seen as large costs, but they should be seen as very major investment opportunities, which would directly pay for themselves in time, and indirectly, hopefully, also generate a wide range of other co-benefits. But nonetheless, we also highlighted that the investment needs associated with this would be equivalent to roughly $1 trillion per year. So a huge chunk of the infrastructure spend that Nick was mentioning earlier would need to be channeled towards low-carbon development in cities. Now, obviously, this is a very high-level global evaluation, and now we are immersed in looking at the co-benefits of this story. So what impact will or could low-carbon development in Chinese or Indian cities have on air pollution and health? What impact could it have on green economy and employment generation? What impact could it have on poverty alleviation and equality aspects, for example? We're working with New Climate Economy at the moment on exactly those issues to carry on developing the evidence base to hopefully persuade cities that these investments are a good thing from a wider range of perspectives than this narrow perspective. The work we've done at Leeds over the last few years also has focused on climate smart cities as we've defined it, and it started in Leeds actually. We had a request from our local enterprise partnership to consider the economic benefits of them adopting a low carbon strategy. That led us to develop a methodology and approach which since then has spread and has been applied in multiple cities around the UK and around the world. We're just finishing our studies on Beijing and Shanghai, and I'll present some of the preliminary results of those today. And we've worked in multiple other countries. We're also expanding out now to look at climate resilience as well as low carbon cities with a new project in Brazil, Argentina and Paraguay just starting. So the method we used was quite a simple one in many ways, in concept at least. The first stage was to look at greenhouse gas inventories and trends, both in the recent past and the recent future, in a city's energy use and energy expenditure and its carbon emissions, and to project these forward into the medium term. And as I said earlier, this was a very deliberate decision to focus on the medium term. We wanted to not be too short-termist and limit the scale of ambition possible, but also to not be too long-term and disconnect somehow with the political timescales of city-level decision makers. So from that, we developed kind of dynamic business-as-usual baselines, looking at the implications of ongoing development in the same form as we've had in the recent past in the near-term future. And against that baseline, we then identify and evaluate a whole series of low-carbon investment opportunities for the city. And we do this in a participatory way with city-level decision makers and stakeholders and so on. And we develop typically a list of perhaps 100 or 150 low-carbon options that could be deployed in the housing sector or in the non-residential building sector or in industry or transport or waste. And so we begin to take a big amorphous problem like climate change and turn it into something more tractable with menus of viable options available to decision makers with an economic evaluation and a carbon assessment of their potential impact associated with them. And then we take all of that kind of measures-based assessment and aggregate it up to the city scale to tell a story about the economic case for cities acting on climate change, as well as the carbon case. So we help cities to work out how much it could cost them to achieve a particular level of decarbonisation and where the most cost and carbon effective options are. And we also develop indicator sets to allow us to kind of track progress, to say, is the city doing the kind of things, does it have the level of ambition, or is it securing the level of investment needed to deliver on its promises? As I said, all of this is based on a form of iterated participatory appraisal, so it's very engaged and builds ownership of the process and the results as we work through the methodology. Geographically, we focused mostly on municipal areas. Temporally, the near to medium-term future. Technically, we do not consider some key elements, it's important to say. We do not focus on the spatial aspects, which we'll come back to later, and we do not look at the system's impacts over time. And economically, we look at the moment just at the direct economic costs and benefits of action. And to give a broader summary of our results, what we find in all of the cities around the world that I showed earlier is that to exploit the cost-effective low-carbon options would require investments of between 0.5% and 2% of city-scale GDP over the next 10 years. So significant investments, when you aggregate them up, they run into billions in many cities, but as a share of GDP, they're not overwhelming. But those investments would then create direct savings in terms of reduced energy bills for the city in particular, of between 2 and getting on for 8.5% and 9% of city-scale GDP. So there are very real and very direct returns on those investments, and they would have payback periods typically of 3 or 4 years. So economically, it's challenging, undoubtedly, to raise that level of investment, but the returns at commercial interest rates are still significant. And if we made all of those investments in the cities which we've evaluated, they would generate carbon reductions of between 15 and 39% of carbon emissions relative to business as usual trends. So very significant flattening of the curve, as we'll see in a second, in terms of city-scale carbon emissions. Now, there's a massive leap in the next bullet point, which was if, and it's a huge if, and we do recognize that, but if those kind of levels of savings were available in other cities around the world, then they could generate reductions equivalent to between 10 and 29% of global energy-related GHG emissions by 2025. So a very significant proportion of what we're trying to achieve through the Paris Agreement, through these kind of city-level initiatives. To give some specific city-level results, for Beijing, where we're just finishing our studies at the moment, we predict that for a relatively mature city like Beijing, still growing significantly, obviously, that its emissions under business as usual conditions, taking into account decarbonized electricity, improved fuel efficiency, also taking into account rebound effects and those kind of things, will grow by roughly 20%, 18% by 2025. So without extra city-level initiatives, emissions will increase. But that if we then make the cost-effective investments, so only investments that would more than pay for themselves over their lifetime, there would be a 4% drop rather than an 18% increase in emissions. And if we recycled the savings from those, then we would get down a little bit further. And you can see the same in multiple other cities around the world. In all cases, we see a flattening of the emissions growth line if we make these kind of investments. To elaborate on that, and in doing so, hopefully to explain the political impact of this to some extent, these are the more detailed results for the Leeds City region. So Leeds City region has a population of 3 million people. It's about 5% of the economy of the UK. And what we found there was that the energy bill for the city region was over £5 billion a year. Just that figure raised the prominence of energy at the city levels in economic policy making. And we also found then that exploiting the cost-effective options could lead to investments of nearly £5 billion. One of our arguments was, if there were other investment opportunities of that scale available at the city scale, what would you be doing? Could you bring Microsoft's headquarters to Leeds? You would fall over yourselves and bend over backwards to bring in that level of investment. And that's the kind of commitment and energy we want you to be showing towards low-carbon investment. As I said, if we made those investments, we predicted that the energy bill would drop by £1.2 billion a year in direct savings, and this would create 4,500 jobs or thereabouts and have wider economic benefits for the economy too. So those kind of numbers help the city to mainstream and prioritise climate change in a way that it hasn't done before. So what are the impacts? Well, one, it's changed the balance of the debate. In all of the cities where we've worked, it's taken some of the fear factor away from a response to climate change and turned it into a more positive story. It's promoted mainstreaming and the integration of climate change, so taking it out of or leaving it to often a rather weak environment or sustainability department and integrating it into the mainstays of urban policy, of transport and housing and energy and infrastructure and so on. It strengthened the case for multi-level coordination. Cities need enabling national policies to act, and often they don't have those, and that's a major barrier to change. And sometimes it's led to the emergence of new public-private civic governance arrangements, especially in the UK actually, where austerity is biting so hard that city-level governments can't deliver this in traditional ways. They need to partner with other actors if they're going to get traction. Second key impact story is around the scope for policy to induce investment. Often the story is that we need to raise trillions of dollars of new climate finance to invest in these kind of options. Actually, we think that in many cities there are policy levers that could be pulled that could induce investment. A good example is green building standards. By adopting tougher green building standards, the city or the country is requiring extra low carbon investment. And policy can play a key role in sometimes inducing that, sometimes incentivizing it, sometimes enabling those kind of investments. So we think, especially at the city scale, that there's much more need for analysis of the potential for urban policy to stimulate the kind of investments that are needed. Thirdly, and I'll whiz through this very quickly, we've worked on new delivery models. So the key question for a city like Leeds is, well, how on earth do you fund that? And we've been looking at the potential, for example, of revolving funds. And those revolving funds, by the way, could receive investment from communities, and civic bonds and community bonds and climate bonds and so on, could provide money to a special interest company which could then invest on the city's behalf in exploiting all of these opportunities. And one of the things we've been focusing on is not so much the potential for private investment or even for public-private partnerships, but for public-civic partnerships. And we find that public and civic investment could do a lot more in time. It might be slower to start in terms of stimulating these kind of investments than private sector investments, which limit themselves to the most profitable opportunities. But there are some limits, and I'll accelerate through these. One of them is what Dimitri was saying at the beginning, is that we haven't integrated a spatial aspect into this, and we would love to do that, but it needs to be done. Here we see a famous graph for urban folk comparing the footprint, the spatial footprint of Atlanta in the US with the footprint of Barcelona. And what we find, not surprisingly, is that the carbon footprint of transport in Atlanta on the left-hand side is roughly 10 times that of Barcelona on the right-hand side. And this emphasizes the importance of compact cities and mixed-use development and livable city centers, for example. Lots of important work is happening on that at LSE and through the new climate economy. Second key limit is around carbon blind spots. And this was work we've just finished in Bristol in the UK. The blue section at the bottom is the production-based emissions. So these are emissions from fuel that's used on electricity that's consumed within Bristol. This is the focus of almost every city-level carbon management initiative. The red lines, on the other hand, relate to the carbon embedded in consumption within Bristol. And here we see that they're roughly twice the scale of the production-based emissions. Yet all of our attention is focusing on the blue areas, and the dotted lines there show the impact of investing £3 billion in Bristol, upgrading its buildings and transport systems and so on. And we find, actually, rather amazingly, that halving its food waste would have a roughly similar carbon impact to upgrading the entire building stock and the transport system. And yet, most cities and most policymakers are completely blind to the carbon saving potential associated with these kind of embedded emissions. And lastly, there's a key question around the dynamics of green growth. And this is something which I know is a complex area economically. But because of our work in many lower and middle income countries, we were very aware that ongoing growth, albeit more lower carbon or more energy efficient growth, would rapidly offset the impact of the kind of investments we were calling for. So the graph here is for Johor Bahru in Malaysia, and we find that for these countries, they could exploit and spend billions or invest billions in exploiting these low carbon options, but ongoing growth would eat the savings within between 5 and 15 years in a kind of ceteris paribus world. And obviously, therefore, we need to be interested in the dynamics of green growth and the extent to which cities move from exploiting the easy options to exploiting the deeper, more challenging options. And these may or may not be as economically promising as some of the other benefits that we've highlighted. So some conclusions quickly. Frequently, there's a very compelling case for at least early-stage low-carbon transitions in cities. And the analysis of the co-benefits may strengthen this case further, but we really need to understand the contingencies and the sensitivities. As well as saying we need to do things, we need an understanding of what cities need to do and how. And there's a clear evidence base to say the way you do it matters, the way you engage, doing this in a pro-poor way obviously will have much wider co-benefits than doing it in a very technocratic way. Presenting that economic case can play a vital role in breaking the inertia, in enabling engagement, in mainstream activities, developing new policies, stimulating investments, targeting interventions, and so on. And this world is moving really quickly at the moment, which is a very positive thing. Cities are getting much better at this very quickly, but there's still a long way to go. We also suggest that exploiting the early stage options can build capacities and they can change cultures, that the atmosphere in the city changes with positive feedback from early examples, and that this then enables them to do the more challenging things that come after those things. But the dynamics are key. And one risk we highlight is that these early stage transitions must evolve into later stage transitions. Otherwise, we run the real risk of cities, rather like countries, locking themselves into a mildly decarbonised future once they've exploited all of the easy options and then not going on to the deeper structural changes which could well be necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, for that presentation. We've got 5 minutes now to take questions from the floor. That's not a long time. So what I'll do is I'll probably gather 3 questions, and depending on your ability to keep questions short and avoid making statements, we might be able to take some other questions afterwards. So we have a spread of questions on the front row. So there's one over here on the right, gentleman here on the left. In the interests of gender equality, are there no women that want to raise any questions? There is a hand right at the back there. There we go.
Mike Kaufman, Planet Hydrogen, Manchester. Already hydrogen has been mentioned by Nicholas Stern, at last coming onto the agenda. You might know that Leeds itself is starting to look at hydrogen seriously. Is your own group taking that hydrogen possibility seriously? Leeds being the first world-class city actually to take it so seriously they're thinking of converting their gas network entirely over to hydrogen.
Should we clump them together? Yeah, you're happy with that. So, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Gideon Richards. I've actually come from the Leeds City region as well. I've got a question in terms of how do we get the building infrastructure changed to a really efficient one? Because it seems like that's a very slow and political process to get changed.
Yep, and at the back there, you're not from Leeds as well, are you?
Hi, I'm Jenny Dodson from the UK Collaborative on Development Sciences. It's really interesting to see this economic case and the benefits that seem to accrue to cities investing in these investing in climate resilient approaches. But I was wondering whether you've done any analysis on the kind of how the benefits might accrue and inequality aspects of it, and whether the benefits were, whether the inclusive growth aspect was within there so that it would accrue to all equally, or whether certain people who invested in it might benefit from it more than others.
Brilliant. So we've got hydrogen, infrastructural change, and inequality and inclusiveness.
So on the hydrogen cities idea, it's fascinating because it came from the left field. All of the energy models, I think, were largely blind to the potential that has been spotted in this particular context. The idea, by the way, is that you add CCS to gas as it comes out of the North Sea, pump the carbon back in, and then distribute hydrogen through the existing gas system. Yeah, we think it has enormous potential. There's still a lot of research to be done to evaluate it properly, and there are, as ever, some key issues. One being public reaction and kind of consumer uptake of hydrogen. It would require, people's boilers to be re-engineered very slightly in their cookers and so on. So, there are enormous challenges potentially, but we think it's very exciting, largely because no one spotted it. So there's a huge low carbon option coming through that we were not aware of in the energy models, and that's quite exciting if you're interested in, radical technological change. On buildings, we in the UK should be a leader in this area. We have an old and inefficient building stock that radically needs upgrading, and it's a desperate shame that the Green Deal has got to the point where it's at. And I think it's also a desperate shame that we haven't had a more live conversation about what happens instead. It's a huge policy vacuum at the moment. The analysis that we've done has suggested that you could reduce the costs of retrofitting the entire building stock in the UK from 35 billion to 25 billion through a revolving fund like the one we flashed up quickly, and that it could be entirely self-financing. So austerity isn't an excuse. We need an enabling government to engage with this and make it happen. But other private and civic actors need to be centrally involved too. It's a shame that more isn't happening. And on the last point about inclusive growth, it's been central to much of our work in many areas. We are at the moment looking at the contingencies that shape the co-benefits of climate action. And as Nick said, that's a rather dry way of kind of distilling a range of massively important broader social issues down into one kind of techie phrase. I think it's been under-addressed at the moment, if I'm honest. I think the scope for pro-poor, low-carbon development in many cities in the global south is enormous. But I don't think we understand it nearly well enough, at least the modelers and the economists and policy wonks like me in these kind of contexts. It has been a big priority in Lima, for example, where we've worked looking at formalization of the housing sector, or in Kolkata, the same kind of issues are there. And I think there are very real risks, actually, that technocratic low-carbon development in cities could be the opposite of pro-poor. They could disadvantage informal settlements much more than advantage them. And we need to work much harder to make sure we do this in the right way so that the co-benefits are significant.